It was so shocking and so wrong. And I hope to God this just saves someone else.
Thanks for joining us here on 9 News. Plus, I'm Chris Bianchi. The family of Christian Glass will receive $19 million.
Christian Glass's parents say a $19 million settlement is less about the money and more about vindication for their son. Glass was gunned down by a Clear Creek County deputy last summer after calling 911 for help.
Now, this makes it the largest police misconduct payout in Colorado history. It's not just money, though. The Glass family also received promises that state law enforcement are going to take concrete steps to prevent another shooting like the one that took place just last summer.
We want to apologize for what happened to Christian.
Joining us with legal expertise on this high-profile case, 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor. And Whitney, I guess I want to start things off. When you first heard that there was a $19 million settlement and some of these promises made, what was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction was I was not surprised. I saw this case, I saw the video, I watched nearly the full 90 minutes of interaction between law enforcement and young Christian Glass. And I've said on multiple segments, this is probably one of the most egregious excessive force cases I've seen. So the 19 million, it is a huge sum of money. The non-monetary terms are very significant as well, but I was not surprised. This is, I mean, there is no justice in this regard, losing your child, but to the extent that the money or whatever can compensate for it, this was an appropriate judgment. It was a huge judgment, but there were so many mistakes that happened in this case.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those. Could you put that $19 million figure into some context? I think anybody can go out there and tell you that's a lot of money, but it was the largest police payout in Colorado history. It's one of the largest in U.S. history. It's a pretty big dollar figure even for these sorts of cases, isn't it?
It really is. And what's interesting, though, is it's spread out among 4 or 5 different departments, because that night, as it progressed, there were a number of different sheriffs and law enforcement that got involved. So it's spread out among, I think, 4 different departments. So it is significant, but it was such an unnecessary use of force. I mean, when you watch the video, and it's heartbreaking to see, but it's out there if people want to really watch the video. And that's really actually very significant in terms of the non-monetary settlement, is that they're using this is a training tool, and actually the parents are going to get an opportunity to talk to new recruits and things of that nature. So it's significant in terms of the 19 million, but it's also significant in terms of how they're moving forward. This is really, I know there's this rub between law enforcement and community, and, police are maybe not in as much favor as they have been in the past, but the real upside, the real silver lining here is how they're using it going forward as training, because this was an example of what not to do as law enforcement. And there's a lot of good officers. There's officers who are going to continue to de-escalate. This was the complete opposite, an absolute escalation from the beginning. So I really am impressed with the non-monetary terms, if you will.
Yeah, well, I actually kind of want to get into those here quickly. Just to kind of back things up quickly for those of you who might not know, Christian Glass, the young man, last June of 2022, he calls the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office, calls 911, and he had a mental health crisis, and 70 minutes later he got shot and killed by the police department. They tried to break into his, as you mentioned, they tried to kind of break into his car where he was having this mental health crisis, and kind of escalated things to the point to where it ended up with him dead.
Yeah, and what was interesting about it was he didn't pose a threat. He was in his car. He's a geologist, or was studying geology, so he had a rock knife and some small things. He told them about it beforehand. As they showed up, he said, "Do you want me to throw him out the window?" And what was interesting about this was he was so nervous and scared, he wouldn't get out of the car. And so he was saying, hey, he actually feared what ultimately happened, was that he was going to be harmed by law enforcement. And so the first officer that showed up, who now has been charged, Andrew Buin, deputy, he showed up and within 3 minutes had escalated and actually drawn his weapon. And so it was this was an opportunity to de-escalate. Christian Glass was not presenting any kind of threat. He was in his car with the doors locked and was just afraid to come out. He was giving the heart sign and things of that nature. And as the police continued to escalate, they then they treated it almost like I don't even know, as if somebody was a real threat, because they shot in the beanbags. They tried to discombobulate him, essentially, and that's a tactic that they use when they're trying to disarm somebody. So they had the lights, the sound, everybody was coming at him, and he was still in his seatbelt in his car, and they took on those measures, escalated things, and then ultimately this deputy, really without cause, just shot him multiple times and killed him. So it was really sad to see. For about an hour, there were different people trying to approach him, trying to talk to him, but nobody really used techniques to sort of coax him out and let him know that he was safe. And ultimately, he wasn't safe, as we know, because of the tragic ending to this case.
Legally, what sort of obligation is a police department held to in that situation? Are they legally, this officer, Andrew Buin, you mentioned Kyle Gould, the sergeant who was there as well, are they required to try and escalate this?
They are, and that is their training. Now, police officers, they can be legally justified in using force if they merely perceive a threat. And so that's
pretty broad.
Right. And the question is, how would a reasonable officer react? So that's why when you go to trial, there's experts who say, in escalation, in law enforcement, who say, yeah, this was a reasonable threat, this was not a reasonable threat. There was no trial here because it was ultimately settled. But when you look at it, the officer wasn't acting reasonably. And when you really look at the video, at the point that he shot, they were escalating. They shot in the beanbags. There were officers surrounding the vehicle, and he did, have a knife, and he was, kind of moving like this. And there was one of the police officers was behind him in the rear door. He opened the door behind the driver's seat. And so the question was, and that officer was really trying to de-escalate things, but it was Andrew Buin who ultimately shot, who was on the hood, and his position was, he was posing a threat with this small rock knife. But when you look at the video, there literally was no way he could have even reached anybody from where he was. And the officer who was behind him, who opened the door, was very calm, didn't even have a weapon pulled. And so it was just completely premature. And so the question is, did that officer act reasonably? And I could not see any officer saying, yes, that was a reasonable use of lethal force. Yeah. And so that is the legal standard. And police have that discretion to say, hey, even if they merely perceive a threat, because it's obviously a dangerous job what they do, and there's people who are really trying to hurt them. This was not the case.
And kind of to that, I think maybe, and it's kind of a real credit to the Glass family. I think they've already said, they've told 9 News, reporter Steve Stager, about the fact that they want to use some of that $19 million and quite a bit of it to start a foundation. And I think they also, as you mentioned, they extracted some promises from law enforcement, where law enforcement is going to be, in a lot of these cases, accompanied, if not entirely taken over by mental health professionals in these sorts of cases. And this may ultimately help law enforcement as well, because you said it, it's a dangerous job being in law enforcement. And to kind of say this from the law enforcement side of things, it's a dangerous job. They're asked to do many different things on a daily basis, and maybe mental health professionals may be better suited to deal with the situation. I think that's where the Glass family is going with this. Is that correct?
I think that's exactly right. And when you look at it, police are being asked, because of the mental health crisis that we're having, because of the homeless situation, because of the escalation in drugs, police have to do so many different things. And in some ways, it's not fair to say, hey, you need to be this mental health expert, you need to de-escalate. At the same time, this officer, I mean, from the beginning, he just came in so hot. It was, you know, it's just, it was the completely wrong disposition. But knowing that there's so many different factors and police are required to do so many different things, moving forward, these non-monetary terms are, they've agreed to dedicate a public park to him. They've agreed to establish a crisis response team, which I think is vitally important. We have that in Denver, where they're now starting to deploy some of those, and they're having phenomenal results.
Both mayoral candidates now want to expand that.
Exactly, and I think that makes so much sense, because you're seeing that there's a time for law enforcement, there's a time for some sort of physical force, and there's a lot of times where it's not required. So they're going to do that. The parents, Simon and Sally Glass, will both be able to speak to new recruits. They're using this actual video as training. So, I mean, it was a tragic loss, and as a parent of, I have a daughter. Oh my gosh, watching this video, I'm sure they watched it, but that must just be heartbreaking. I don't know how you move forward from that, but that is the silver lining. I know they're talking about setting up a foundation with the money. They want to do something publicly, but these other things, the training and the real emphasis on that, I think is phenomenal. I think that will actually make a difference going forward, because in this day and age, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of, you know, where we are in society, you're just seeing more and more mental health issues. And it was, folks were saying, in fact, his parents said, I wished he would have just called AAA or something else, but he didn't know. Of course, they weren't blaming him. They were just saying, wow, you know, calling for 911 resulted in his death. And it was really, he was just stuck. He was just, you know, stuck on this rock. He just needed to get towed out. And so these things going forward, I think, will make a difference. And of course, what they do with the money, which is, this is how our system works. We can't. I've had many closing arguments where I said, we can't go back in time. We can't change this. All we can do, our system is limited. So what you can do is try and make people whole, and we do that with monetary compensation. But what's unusual, and so this is a huge, 19 million is, as you said, the largest settlement in the state that we know of. But these non-monetary things, I think, are where we'll see some difference.
Tell me, I guess as we wrap things up here, about the officers themselves, what they're facing criminally.
Right. So the criminal case are going forward. One of the deputies who did the shot, he's being charged with second-degree murder and official misconduct and reckless endangerment. The sergeant, Kyle Gould, he's been charged with criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. And of course, this was a settlement with a number of different units, because at one point or another, there were different departments, different counties. And interesting, the Colorado State Patrol, they showed up, and when they called into their sergeant, he said, has there been a crime committed? Is there any danger? Is all these other things? And then he actually said on the radio, okay, we'll just move on. There's no reason for us to be there. And I think that would have been significant if it went to trial. And of course, the settlement is always I mean, when you go to trial, you're rolling the dice in many regards. But the fact that they agreed to a settlement is voluntary by both sides. So the fact that they agreed to this huge settlement, to me, as the lawyer tells me, they recognize the difficulty in trying to go to trial with this, and especially with things when there's an actual department saying there's no crime, there's no harm, just move on. I mean, that's a key fact.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts about this case?
Yeah, I think the final thoughts are, we're just in an era where, we now have these police accountability bills. People are looking at the police in a different way. Before, when police went to court and testified, it was their word was solid. A jury would trust it, and now there is that distrust, and it's unfortunate because we still need, you know, a police force, and we still need those kind of protections. But here, this was just a travesty on so many levels. And so moving forward, in Colorado, we have the police accountability bill, and we have that across the nation. A lot of different states have enacted these police accountability, but even with that, it didn't prevent this situation. Nobody said, all right, hold on, there's no threat, just, you know, let's put our weapons, you know.
Chill out.
Yeah, right, stand down. And so that didn't work in many ways, but going forward, I think that this is going to make a difference. And it's a tragedy, and it's going to have rippling effects, though, going forward. And I think throughout the state and throughout the nation, this video can be used in terms of what not to do. So that is the silver lining. And so it's about training, it's about the type of personnel we get, and of course getting these crisis response teams. I think that is fundamental because, again, in defense of the police, they have so many different factors to consider and so many other things, but this one was egregious on the highest level. I mean, I've honestly, I feel confident in saying I think this was the most egregious excessive force case that I have seen. Just because the lack of threat. He wasn't a threat. And so it's a tragedy, but as many tragedies, good can come out of it. And I think that's going to be the case here. And I'd be really interested to see what the parents do with their foundation. They seem to be really motivated to try and prevent this from ever happening again.
And no doubt about that. We'll find out in the coming weeks, months, a bit more about that. But in the meantime, Whitney, we appreciate your insight on this obviously tragic case. But again, hopefully good moving forward comes out of this. But Whitney, thanks for your time here today.
Sure. Good to be here.